I went to a talk at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, and it was on native plants, and Doug Tallamy was a speaker, and he is absolutely awesome. If you do get a chance to see, I know his lectures come up periodically, and if you do get a chance to see him, please take advantage of it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how it all began. Occasionally we encounter a concept so close to our noses that we cannot see it. And this concept that Doug Tallamy is presenting is it's so simple, but it's so obvious once you look through the lenses that he does. This book is available through the Port Washington Library and also through interlibrary loan. So it's easy for you to get a hold of. Next slide. Now, this is an example of something he noticed on his property. He noticed that some of the leaves on his property were not bothered at all by insects. They were in pristine condition. And then he noticed that other leaves on his property were obviously eaten by caterpillars. So the top two are Bradford pear and autumn olive, and those are not native plants. And so the native insects avoid them. And then the bottom two are black cherry and red maple, and obviously they're big supporters of native insects. Next slide. So why are native plants important? It's interesting that you might ask a large number of gardeners this question, and you're going to get a variety of answers. Next question. Next slide. You might hear them say they create a sense of place by growing plants that belong there. Oh, that's interesting. Next slide. Or you avoid releasing yet another invasive alien which would smother native plants. Next slide. You might be avoiding fertilizer and herbicides needed for traditional manicured lawns. Next slide. And another thought might be you're rescuing native plants from extinction. Next slide. But the most compelling reason is that native plant species are necessary to support the insects that anchor the ecosystems that once made this land such a rich source of life for its indigenous peoples. And that is really important. Okay, next slide. So why are insects important? Every animal on this planet gets its food from eating plants or by eating something else that ate the plant. That's because plants are the only organism that can capture the sun's energy and turn it into food through photosynthesis. The most important groups of animals that take energy from the plants and pass energy to other animals are insects. And insects are unusually nutritious. Next slide. They proportionally contain more protein than beef. Next slide. They're unusually high in valuable energy, and that they get from the plants. Next slide. And they're an essential link in the food chain. Next slide. So these are a couple of the tasty insects that birds eat and feed to their young: grasshoppers, cabbage moth caterpillars, cabbage worms. Next slide. So the food chain depends on insects. They're at the bottom of the food chain, and they are just the basis of everything in the environment. Next slide. The insects eat native plants. Next. The chipmunks and squirrels and mice and amphibians eat the insects that eat the plants. Next slide. And foxes, snakes, birds of prey eat the small mammals that eat the chipmunks, squirrels, mice, amphibians that eat the insects. So it's all interchangeable and dependent on each other. Next slide. A lot of people don't realize that the primary food source for most baby birds is insects. It's primarily caterpillars. It's not the seeds or the berries that we think that it would be. The goldfinches do feed seeds to their babies, and I believe that might be about the only native bird that does, at least in North America. thousands of insects are needed to raise a single clutch of young birds. It takes 6,000 caterpillars to raise a little batch of chickadees. Next slide. However, not all plants are created equal. So most of our native insects are not able to eat alien plants, and we are replacing the native plants with alien species at an alarming rate. And these would be examples, some of the examples would be, if you think about it, like Siberian iris, Oriental bittersweet, the Korean spice viburnum, Japanese anemone, and English ivy. If you think about it, you know they're alien from the names of the plants that we buy at the garden center. Next slide. So why cannot insects eat alien plants? This is the crux of the key, I think, to understanding this. Next slide. It takes a long evolutionary time for insects to adapt to the specific chemical mix of a particular plant. Next. 90% of insects are specialists that have each evolved with just a few plant species. So for a particular insect can only eat a certain number of different plant species. Not all insects eat all plant species. Next. And the insects will not survive if their food sources are crowded out or somehow unavailable. Next. And they will actually starve before they recognize alien plants as food. Next. So leaf chemistry determines the taste and palatability. Next. If you grind up a leaf and you analyze the chemical compounds, no two plant species have the same chemistry. And some of the chemical compounds that we might see are like that might be present in leaves or are present in leaves are alkaloids, glycosides, phenols, and they sound kind of nasty when you think about it. Next. So the alien leaf compounds can be nasty to the insects, and at least a leaf is distasteful to the insects and they turn away from it, and at worst the leaf is toxic unless or until the insects evolve to eventually develop detoxifying enzymes for the chemicals in that particular plant. Next. When Doug Tallamy was a little boy, his family lived out in the country, and there was a pond not too far from his home. And after school every day, he would run over to the pond and just sit and watch the wildlife. And he would watch the tadpoles grow into frogs over the course of the summer. He would see snakes kind of slithering through the grass. He would see foxes roaming around, and he was pretty happy with his childhood experiences. And then one day he was out at the pond visiting his little friends at the pond, and he happened to see a bulldozer coming up over the hill. And the bulldozer came closer and closer to the pond. And Doug suddenly realized what was happening, and he started running around and grabbing as many frogs as he could to try to rescue them. Well, needless to say, he wasn't able to save very many frogs that day, and their habitat was now gone. The snakes were gone, the foxes were gone, the wildlife just left because the people that had brought the property next door had the pond filled in so that they could build, next slide, a beautiful suburban house with a sterile lawn full of chemicals and fertilizer. And this is happening far too often in suburbia. Next slide. So we think, as far as wildlife goes, we think there's always been someplace else for wildlife to go, and so it's okay if we put in a nice manicured sterile lawn. But this is a satellite picture of North America, and the light shining from all the populated areas points out how few someplace else's there have been left behind, and it doesn't leave a whole lot of room for wildlife in this picture. Next slide. So the result of suburban development is that there's too many alien plants introduced, all these wonderful garden nursery plants. Okay, next slide. Native plants are crowded out by aliens. Next, there's less insects able to survive because there's less native plants that survive. And there's fewer animals and birds that depend on the insects that will survive as a result. Next. This is the rivet. This illustrates the rivet theory. If you have a great big ship and it's held together, the hull is held together by rivets. And so at some point, the one rivet might pop. Well, that's okay. That's not a big problem. But then another rivet might pop. And eventually more rivets pop. And at some point, if you lose enough rivets, you're going to start to get a leak in the ship. And the ship is eventually going to go down. And this is basically what's happening with the loss of native habitat and our ecosystem. It's slowly sliding downhill because of all the development that's going on in our environment. Next. So these are some of the examples of invasive plants that have been introduced. Garlic mustard is probably the most well-known in this area. It was introduced to North America by European settlers in the 1800s for culinary and medicinal purposes. And it has infamously taken over large swaths of forest and covered over the understory of forest and has spread into a lot of our yards through birds carrying the seeds. Next. Buckthorn is another big problem. It was not too long ago, 20 years ago or so, was being sold as a hedge plant for suburban yards. And it was brought to North America in the 1800s again as an ornamental shrub intended to serve as hedges, but that has taken over and is easily, the berries are loved by the birds and the birds spread them and they again cover up the understories in the woods and again creep into our suburban yards. And they're very hard to control. By the way, the garlic mustard, for example, the seeds stay in the ground stay viable for at least 7 years. So you can pick garlic mustard every year for 7 years before you'll really be making a dent in it. And buckthorn again is, if you just cut the buckthorn off, it's going to sprout and make many sprouts instead of just one. And you pretty much have to control buckthorn by either pulling the smaller plants or by using herbicides, cut it and then paint the stump with herbicides to kill the root. Next slide. Japanese knotweed. It's kind of like bamboo. It looks like bamboo. It's from Asia. It's obviously an alien. And it's been called one of the world's worst invasive species. It grows through rhizomes and underground root systems, and it will come up through asphalt. It'll come up through just about anything. It's not susceptible. It's very difficult to control, even with chemical control. And you constantly have to cut it back and keep applying the herbicides and hope that you might get ahead of it, but it's probably the biggest headache as far as an invasive plant goes. Next slide. In a balanced, healthy ecosystem, next, there's no one member of the food chain that dominates. If one starts to increase, it's soon brought back into equilibrium by other members of the community. And this would be with plants or animals. Next. Today's gardeners, unfortunately, at the first sign of an insect, they run for the spray can. They run down to Home Depot and they grab whatever they can find that'll kill as many insects as possible and just kind of blast their garden, blast their plants. And they're causing havoc in the biological world. Next. Remember that a sterile garden is one that's teetering on the brink of collapse because its checks and balances are gone. So normally if you get an upsurge in one type of insect, that upsurge will either consume all of its the plant material that it would eat, or it's going to just die out because there's overpopulation. And then another one will come in. So normally there's good checks and balances until we try to help, and that's not really helping if we try to help with chemicals. Next slide. So what can gardeners do? We can, number one, reduce the mowed portion of your lawn by enlarging your plant beds. That's one thing. Next, you can, the first step would be to maybe start by incorporating some natives into your traditional plantings, and or the all-in approach would be to install all natives into your property. That's a big chore, but at least you could start with a few and kind of build up into the primarily native population. Next, you can provide food, water, and shelter for birds that would just harbor the birds and invite them to come in and partake of your native plants, so they can raise their families and live safely. Another option, instead of the mowed manicured lawn, is to use no-mow or eco-grass. Those are two brands of fescue blends that need no mowing, watering, or fertilization. And the next slide. This shows a lawn with eco-grass or no-mow. It grows to maybe about 6 inches tall. You can mow it once or twice during the season if you want to, but you don't have to mow it either. And it's just a really nice alternative to a lawn if you're okay without the 1 inch or 2 inch high, perfectly manicured mowed lawn. Next slide. So these are some examples of what you can do with native plants. These, in the lower left, it looks like we've got a primrose there, and in the upper center, it looks like we have a coneflower. It's hard for me to recognize a lot of the other plants, but you can do a lot of native effects that look, planting native plants doesn't have to be messy or disorganized. It can be just beautiful, and this is one example. Next slide. This is an example of, I believe it's lavender, and then I'm not positive what the ornamental grass is, but you could switch out with like little blue stem, which would be 2 to 3 feet high. You could do Indian grass, which would be 5 to 6 feet high, and then you can do lavender hyssop, which would substitute for the lavender here. Next. In this slide, toward the left, it looks like we have lady's mantle, which is Echinacea. In the front, it looks like we have butterfly weed. This is a really beautiful planting, and they're low and not highly structured garden. Next. This shows Echinacea. It looks like a penstemon. Butterfly weed is the bright orange one in front. That's about my favorite, I think, for the beautiful, beautiful color. And then a little bit of a Rudbeckia down in front. And the white plant in the lower right, it could be wild quinine possibly, or it could be boneset. Next. On the left, the tall plant is joe-pye weed. Then we've got the Echinacea. We've got Liatris, the purpley spike plants. We've got, it looks like maybe Rudbeckia and then some Echinacea also. And on the right, when I look at this closely, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of true native plants here. I see daylilies, and there's an ornamental grass, and those, I'm not sure, maybe roses possibly in front. And to the lower right, it looks like that could be one of the perennial geraniums, but it's still done well and mimics the native plants at least. It's not a traditional planting. Next. In this case, we've got Echinacea and Rudbeckia, and then we've got lavender hyssop, kind of to the right, the purple to the right in the back. And in front of the double window of the house, that could be Canada wild rye. If it isn't, it's similar, and that would be comparable, or it could be Culver's root. Next slide. To the left, it looks like we have, the upper left looks like we have Canada wild rye. It looks like we have some, looks like we have Monarda in the center. We have Rudbeckia scattered throughout. And then in the front, I don't know, that might be Oxeye Daisy, which looks kind of like Shasta Daisy, but it's not. And then on the right, it looks like we have Echinacea and butterfly weed, and then a little bit of Echinacea too. Next slide. In the front lower left, I believe that could be little Joe Pye weed, and then the big yellow mass, that could be Rudbeckia. On the right, to the left, the orange is the butterfly weed, the purple spires are Liatris, and I'm not positive about the rest of them. Okay, next slide. These are examples of rain gardens, which can be, they would obviously be rain-loving plants. Next slide. So I think okay, plants for shade. This is the plants that we've shown before were more of sunny plants. These are plants for shade. Wild geranium is one. Jen, go back a slide. I don't know if we missed one or not. No, okay, go back. Plants for shade. And then to the right is Zigzag Goldenrod. It's the only goldenrod that's a shade loving. And it's hard to see from this particular picture, but the stem zigs at each little joint. It zigs and zags. So it's kind of a cool plant, and it likes to grow among ferns, as shown. While geraniums are just beautiful in the spring, and they're very, very easy to grow. Next slide. So these are the top 10 native plant picks for Southeastern Wisconsin micro prairie gardens. So if you wanted to add like basic plants to your existing gardens, these would be the top 10 that Neil would suggest. He was the founder of Prairie Nursery. Number one, the three parameters are you need low growing or lower growing prairie plants that are maybe preferably like 1 to 2 feet tall, maybe 3 feet. Southeastern Wisconsin does have clay soil, so you need to have that type of plant that likes that environment. And then full to partial sun would be the most common type of plant that you would use in our gardens in this area. Next. So the first one would be Cream False Indigo, which is also one of the Baptisias. It has a May and June bloom, and it's beautiful. It's loved by bumblebees. It dies back every year and grows up again, so it's amazing. It can be, oh gosh, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. Next slide. The second one that he would recommend would be the butterfly weed. This is my favorite. It's a butterfly favorite, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful plant. It blooms in June through August, and it attracts monarchs. This is like the monarch magnet, one of them. Next. Wild quinine. This is a very hardy plant. The little blossoms on the right are just really beautiful. It blooms in June through September. It's an extra long bloomer, so that would be a nice one to consider. Next. And then, of course, the Rudbeckia, which is really common, and this is the native cultivar. It's the native plant. It's not a cultivar. A lot of the cultivars might be, say, double petal, doubles or more, and those are really, really hard for the insects to get to the pollen. So this is a single type plant, and that's the most conducive to having insects and pollinators come in and partake of the plant. It's very easy. It's fast growing, June through September bloom. Next. Purple coneflower, that's another one that's really, really popular, and there's a lot of cultivars of that, but do your best to stay with this native variety. It's very popular with the butterflies, as I'm sure you know, and it blooms July through September. Next. Rattlesnake Master. This is a really cool plant. It's similar to the agave type plants or the plants that in the desert. It has a spiky flower and it attracts a lot of beneficial insects. It blooms from July through August. It can take a few years to establish. I think we had our prairie for about 7 years before we ever saw it appear, so you have to be patient. The native plants spend the first several years without much top growth. Most of their growth is developing, putting down the root system. So that's why it can be a while, be several years or longer. Baptisia is another one that takes a long time to establish from a seed because it's taking so long to put down its really deep root system. And that's why native plants are so durable, is because their roots go down 6, 8, 12 feet in some cases. Next slide. Prairie blazing star, Liatris. These are the beautiful lavender spires, July through August bloom, and pollinators love the blossoms. Next. This is one of the goldenrods. Ohio goldenrod is probably the most common. It's a pollinator favorite. It's fairly compact. It blooms August through September. The Canadian goldenrod or the Canada goldenrod is the most common, and that one is pretty aggressive, and it's good to try to stay away from that particular one because it can get a little over rambunctious and take over a lot of your plantings. Next. There's a lot of asters. This is a smooth aster. The asters generally bloom August through October. They're one of the latest blooming plants in the fall for the pollinators. So they're a really nice garden addition. They also combine really well with the goldenrod plants, the different types of goldenrods, the beautiful, actually there's different shades of smooth aster or any of the asters. There's blue, there's purple, there's pink, a lot of variations, and they're just a beautiful fall color. Next. And then as far as grasses for southeastern Wisconsin, the little blue stem is probably the most popular. It's real durable. It has a beautiful bluish red, actually starts out blue and then turns more red later in the fall. And all the little, the seeds that it provides are really good food. Also, the prairie dropseed is just a beautiful, it's a little green clump grass. And when you brush against it, it has a real special scent to the seed. When you brush against the seed pods, it's a really interesting scent. A little bit musky, but it's quite distinctive and pretty cool. Next. This is an interesting table. It shows native trees and shrubs which support many moth and butterfly species. So you may have trouble possibly reading this, but the oak tree supports 534 species of Lepidoptera. This is just Lepidoptera, that's a moth species. And the willow and cherry and plum are 456 species that are supported. And you contrast that, well, birch is 413, poplar, crabapple, blueberry, cranberry, maple, elm, pine, there's hickory, hawthorn. They all support in the hundreds of moth species. However, the ginkgo tree, which is from Asia, only supports 5 insects, so 5 types of moths. So you can see the huge difference that the native plants can make in supporting the environment, the insects that are the basis of our environment. Next, okay, so what about either cultivars or nativars? There's many plant breeders, they find a native plant that looks a little bit unusual, and then they start to tweak it and breed it with other native plants of that unusual character. They're trying to get a better color, larger bloom, so they're called nativars, which would be like a cultivated native. But these natives, because they're not truly native plant, nativars are not truly native plants, and they do have limited ability to support the same number of insects that a true native plant would. Next slide. They reduce the genetic diversity of the original plants, and they reduce the value of the food sources. Next. So how do you know if it's a cultivar or a nativar? You look for an added name, often in quotes, like in this particular case on the right, the purple coneflower is the native plant, and then they have bright star after it, and that means that's actually a cultivar. So the Echinacea is a scientific name, the purple coneflower is the common name, and bright star indicates that it's a nativar. Next. And about wildflowers, most of the wildflower mixes in big box stores or some garden catalogs contain Asian or European flowers. They displace the native sources of food and shelter for our birds and wildlife. Next. So plant native flowers, look for native flowers instead of wildflowers. Wildflowers may lead you down the wrong path more often than not. And the native flowers are the ones that support our native insects. Next. But it's not too late. Most species can live quite nicely if their basic needs are met. And by favoring native plants over aliens, the gardeners can sustain biodiversity that's one of this country's richest assets. Next. So a few square feet or several acres will definitely make a difference. Next. So hope grows in every backyard. Next. So these are some of the resources that I list when I normally give this presentation, but as Jen mentioned, the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory native plant sale would definitely be your route to go. There's a wonderful list of natives there, and the information is on the website, and Jen had it on the screen at the beginning of the presentation. So give this some thought, maybe just start with a few and kind of gradually increase as you go. And again, if you get a chance to listen to Doug Tallamy lecturing, go for it, because he comes around in the area from time to time. And also, if you get his book, Bringing Nature Home, from one of the local libraries, or get it through an interlibrary loan, I think you will be impressed with his explanation and how he goes about explaining this concept that's right in front of our nose. So that's our basic information for tonight. And if there's any questions, I can take them.
Okay, so a few questions came in while you were talking, and I can read those out, but everyone else, feel free to either type questions in, or as soon as I'm done asking the questions that already came in, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. So let's start out with, someone asked, can insects eat daylilies or daisies?
Well, it's all relative, but they're definitely going to be compromised on, I mean, they're not native plants, and so they're going to be compromised on how many insects could eat them and how much, they might just take a bite or two. But if you see plants like, I can't recall ever seeing any insect damage on daylilies, actually. And the same thing with daisies too, and maybe I've missed it, but I would be skeptical.
Another question is, someone asked, my neighbor in South Carolina used a company called Mosquito Joe to spray their yards and trees to kill mosquitoes. How much harm does this do to insects in nearby houses?
How much harm does it do to insects at nearby houses?
I think in nearby yards, like how?
Well, if it's sprayed in the air, depending on the drift, I mean, if you spray Roundup and it's a moist, windy day with high temp, if you have high temperatures when you're spraying insecticides or chemicals or herbicides, I guess it would really be herbicides. Some of the chemicals can aerosolize and vaporize and drift. So that could be a problem. That could be a problem. Yes. It'd be hard to prove too. But that's a really, really good point, especially so that you don't destroy your own plants in your own yard.
Another question. Let's see. What native plants 1 to 2 feet high do you recommend for a pretty steep slope in partial shade? Looking for more of a ground cover. Do you have any recommendations?
I would have to, if I could get an email, maybe I could put together a little list. I don't know if that's possible.
Yes, I can connect. I will send his contact information to you.
Sure.
After.
Sure.
So, Doug, we will be reaching out to you with some suggestions.
And also, just generally, when the term ground cover is used, that, ground cover fills in. So beware. If it can fill in, it can take over. So be cautious. And if people say, if your neighbor says, oh, I have this plant, it's just all over my yard and I just love it. Would you like a couple of pieces of it, a couple of cuttings of it? Be careful. You want things that kind of are well behaved and stay in place.
Yes, and that is something that we do has been brought up, and I think another speaker is going to talk more. I think Danielle Bell might talk more about that too. Is like the border between a lot of natives are great, but sometimes some of them are still a little aggressive. Let's see, what else do? Another question is, what do people do if their communities consider native yard plantings to be weedy or messy? That is a common barrier to folks.
If the neighbors mention that it's messy,
they asked if you're. Sorry, as soon as anyone asks something, it moves everybody up. What do people do if their communities consider native yard plantings to be weedy or messy?
I think they should talk to someone that maybe is familiar with native plants. And I know that's a common concern. And I know, Jen, I know you've got some resources lined up this summer so that there could be a discussion and kind of address that.
Yes. So we will have a panel in a couple of weeks, including a landscape designer who deals with these issues a lot. So I would recommend bringing this question to them. But we are also have some resources on our website of landscape designs of well-behaved plants that might not look as messy. But the other thing, I think it's also an opportunity to talk with folks. You may not win over everybody, but a lot of times people just don't know like what they're looking at. And a lot of times people see them as weedy when they just don't know what they're looking at. Not everybody, but maybe reaching out to your city might help too. Let's see. Is poison ivy a host for insects? Are there pros and cons of removing poison ivy?
I don't know that poison ivy is a host. Oh my gosh, it makes my skin crawl. Poison ivy does spread, and I'm terribly allergic to it. So that I would want removed. I mean, it wouldn't be anything that would work for me. I guess I don't see any particular reason to keep it around. And I know there are brush sprays that you can use to kill it. But it's pretty nasty in my book. And I wouldn't wait for insects to eat it. I'd take action now.
Information about sedges. We have some information on our website, but Shar, if you have advice about using sedges.
Sedges are really cool. The only thing is they do generally like moister soils. So you kind of have to have the right soil or environment for it, but they're beautiful and they would have a grassy appearance. So I think they're wonderful if you've got the right environment.
And they do host a few more. Neither grasses nor sedges host a ton of moths and butterflies, but sedges host more. So if you do have it, a lot of people recommend that if you like that grass look. Is wild quinine an aggressive?
Jen, one comment I have is that I heard a suggestion from someone that if you plant mostly sedges and then fill it in with little specimen native plants, that's a really cool look too. So that's one thing to think about.
I've seen some gorgeous pictures of people doing that, and it does look awesome.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's one of my dreams for my yard. Is wild quinine an aggressive grower?
Generally not, but it really depends on the environment. Sometimes you'll get plants that are aggressive for one location and others not so in other locations. In our location, we have a horrible trouble with big blue stems, so I would never recommend that to anyone. And we also have a horrible problem with cup plant, which is a beautiful plant, but it spreads like nuts. So those are two that did not do well for us. But by the same token, we don't really have much trouble with Canada goldenrod. So it really depends on your soil type and sun and microclimate.
I see a couple of people have unmuted themselves, so if you want to ask your question, go for it.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Joanne. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. There are people that are not allergic and do not react to poison ivy. In addition, no animals react to poison ivy. And there are a lot of insects and animals that eat it and use it. And they tell people if it's in an area where there aren't humans around, you should leave it alone. Just a little piece of poison ivy advice.
That's good to know because that's not a plant that I would have spent much time finding out about. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Sure. You're welcome.
Sure.
Any other questions? If not, I do want to do one last plug if you are in this area. A lot of those top 10s that Shar highlighted, we're selling at the plant sale. So, and we have more information about where to grow them, how to grow them, all that kind of stuff on our website too. So if you're interested, check that out. Otherwise, I hope to see you guys on a future webinar.